This is Shalom World Podcast.
Welcome to Voyage. This is a podcast where we take you to the world of the Apocalypse of John. This is the book of Revelation. I am your host, Francis Hogan. At long last, we have arrived at chapter 6. So, as we say, let the action begin. And the very first thing I want to say is that Jesus has been shown to us in chapter 5, verse 4, that he's the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And the prophet Amos, chapter 1, verse 2 says, when the lion roars, who cannot help feeling afraid? Okay, and listen to Jeremiah. This is Jeremiah 25 from verse 30. The Lord roars from on high. He makes his voice heard from his holy place. That is from the temple. You see, when Jesus actually opens the seals, he's in this marvelous liturgical situation with the whole of creation in adoration before him. That's when he opens the seals at the absolute right moment and in the right place and in the right conditions. So the Lord roars from on high. He makes his voice heard from his holy dwelling place. He roars loud against his sheepfold. He shouts aloud like those who tread the grape. The sound reaches all the inhabitants of the earth to the far ends of the world. For the Lord is indicting the nations, arraigning all flesh for judgment. The wicked he abandons to the sword. It is the Lord who speaks. Yahweh Sabaoth says this, see, the disaster spreads from nation to nation. A mighty tempest rises from the far ends of the earth. So the great storm begins in chapter 6. So I want to pick up in verse 34. Howl, shepherds, shriek, roll on the ground, you lords of the flock. Now he's addressing the leaders of his own people. For the days have arrived for your slaughter, like the finest rams you will fall. No refuge now for the shepherds, no escape for the lords of the flock. Listen, a shout from the shepherds, a howl from the lords of the flock. For the Lord has laid the pastures waste. Their quiet sheepfolds are in ruins. The lion has left his lair. Their land is a wasteland now, thanks to the destroying sword and the fierce anger of the Lord. Now that's a pretty good introduction to chapter 6. So, while everyone in chapter 5 is still in prostration before the Lord, the Lamb who has just received the scroll from the Father now decides this is the moment to begin breaking the seals. Then I saw the Lamb break one of the seals, and I heard one of the 4 animals that was around the sanctuary. So this is happening during this liturgy. You need to understand that. This is not happening outside of it. This is a continuation of what is happening in the liturgy. I heard one of the 4 animals shout in a voice like thunder. So that's a voice like God. Come, he said. And immediately a white horse appeared, and the rider on it was holding a bow, but he didn't have any arrows. So when you're reading scripture to understand, you must pick up clues like that. He was given the victor's crown. Notice he doesn't have it by himself. It has to be given to him by somebody else. And he went away to go from victory to victory. Then he broke a second seal, and I heard the second animal that is around the sanctuary shout, come. And out came another horse, bright red, and its rider was given this duty. Notice, was given. He is a servant. He's not a king. He's not a lord. He was given this duty to take away peace from the earth and to set people killing each other. He was given a huge sword, which of course represents war. Then he broke, he is Jesus. Then Jesus broke the third seal, and I heard the third animal shout, come. And immediately a black horse appeared, and its rider was holding a pair of scales representing famine. And I seemed to hear a voice from among the 4 animals to say, a ration of corn for a day's wages and 3 rations of barley for a day's wages. But do not tamper with the oil and the wine. That's interesting. And then the Lamb, who was in his lion mode, broke the 4th seal. And I heard the voice of the fourth animal from around the sanctuary say, "Come." And immediately another horse appeared, deathly pale. And its rider was called Plague, or as we would say nowadays, Pandemic. And Hades followed at his heels. They were given authority over a quarter of the earth to kill by the sword, by famine, by plague, and by wild beasts. The drama has begun. Okay. Where did John get the idea of 4 animals riding in all directions and different colours to carry out different tasks? Has he picked that out of his head? And of course, you know the answer is no. When you go to Zechariah chapter 6, verses 1 to 6, Zechariah speaks about, "I raised my eyes, and this is what I saw, 4 chariots coming from between the 2 mountains. And the mountains were mountains of bronze. The first chariot had red horses, the second one had black horses, the third one had white horses, and the fourth one had vigorous piebald horses." And they went on to do the task that God had designed for them. So John is not using new imagery. We've said this from the beginning. He's using imagery that is well known to all the members of the early church. So we have to try and look at these images and unpack what is being said, if we can. So a little introduction first. So the consequences of opening the seals is what is going to be the action that we see in chapter 6. And what we will be looking at, I want you to have this global picture and not get stuck in individual things. The global picture is the movement of the church from where she's at in chapters 2 and 3 through a real purification to become what the Lord wants her to become, which is the bride and the final triumph. So the opening of the seals are placed between the anticipated victory of the Lamb in chapter 5 and the way it works out to its factual reality in chapter 19 and further on. So you'll always be told that heaven is ahead of where the earth is, because everything in heaven is eternal and it takes time for things to work out on the earth. So we see a grim picture of war and conquest and famine and pestilence and so on. But we see that the origin of the disasters is actually from the earth. When God allows something to happen, it's because human beings have moved into that position anyway, and that's the direction they're going. He simply allows it to happen. So the happenings that John actually refers to has to be read at 2 ends of the scale of time. One is what is happening in John's day, and the other is what is happening in the end times. Both have to be seen because both of these time scales are actually in the entire text. And the reason for that is that John has a template, and the template is the final discourse of Jesus in Matthew 24, Luke 21, in which Jesus speaks about the destruction of Jerusalem, and in speaking about it, speaks about the end of the world as well. So the principles that he lays down here applies there. John is following that pattern. So we have to find out what is for the first century and what is for the end times. So the first thing that has been made perfectly clear is that God is in control of the events. The first rider was given. The second rider is told. The other one has this job to do. They are not in control. They're mere servants. Okay. What we're about to see is the testing of the nations. We saw judgment begin at the household of God, as Peter said it would in chapters 2 and 3. Now the testing of the nations also must take place. And suffering is part of God's providential care of the human race, lest we self-destruct. The amazing thing is that we are really capable of self-destructing. Look how close we came to in the 20th century to a nuclear conflict, would have wiped out probably most of us. We have this awful thing inside of us. And so John wants to shock the church into really taking responsibility for standing before God and intervening on behalf of the human race. Okay, so this white horse, white represents victory. If it's a white horse, of course, it doesn't represent holiness and priesthood as the white garment does. It represents victory. And we find that in Rome of the first century, the victorious generals, when they were having their triumphal processions, they rode on white horses. When you go to Persia, which is Iran today, white was the colour of the gods as well. And we know that priests, even in the pagan temples, wore white. And the priests of God, in their worship of God, and under the covenant of Moses, they wore white as well, just as our priests do. And so we're told that the rider was given victory. He was allowed to do it. Now, one of the problems we have in coming into the book of Revelation is the many interpretations that people give. Sometimes I will give you all of the interpretations and then tell you why I have chosen the one I've chosen, which is what I'm going to do now. When you come to the first century, it seems that the Emperor Domitian, the Caesar that was ruling the world at the time when John is actually writing, he rode into Palestine for the reconquering of Palestine on a white horse. In other words, he approached them as a rider on a white horse, conquering all around him. So in the first century, that makes sense. Now, some interpreters want to say that this rider is actually Christ himself. That's an impossible interpretation. And the reason why, for me, it's impossible is that we are in heaven. The Lamb is at the throne of God. He's holding the scroll in his hands. And when he opens the seals, something happens on the earth. So this rider can't be him. It sure looks like him. Because when he returns in Revelation chapter 19, he comes riding on a white horse. The white horse, of course, he doesn't physically come like that. It's only a symbol. But the white horse means that he's coming in victory and power and glory. Okay. So it's because of the similarity of this horse with that one that people make the mistake of thinking that it's the Christ. But all that follows the white horse, the red horse and the black horse and so on, and the pale horse, that doesn't make sense that they would follow the white one. It doesn't make sense. This cannot be the Christ. No. But it looks like him. And if it looks like him, you are getting an introduction to the Antichrist, the one who pretends to be the Christ. We'll deal with that more and more and more as we go along. Some interpreters even say that this white horse is the gospel and its victorious march through the countries and the centuries. But the text isn't about the gospel or the spreading of the gospel. The text is about the tribulation of the church. So it's the wrong context. It doesn't fit the text at all. So the final interpretation, the one that I accept, is that we are being introduced to the Antichrist. Notice I say introduced. The Antichrist will actually be shown to us in chapter 13. But there is something about this particular rider which I will tell you much more about later on, okay, when I go to do a summary of the whole thing for you. So once we get this rider sorted, then we understand that if the first one is some kind of an introduction to the Antichrist, then it makes sense that it's followed by war and famine and death and so on. In other words, disaster upon disaster upon disaster. Okay. Let's come to the second horse. And this is the red horse. And again, it's one of the four animals around the throne that's actually calling this red horse. In other words, there's a connection between the worship of the church and what is actually happening. Because as I said, if we pray that God's kingdom will come, well, God has to do something to actually bring it about. And so the red horse is the horse of war. It represents bloodshed and slaughter, both all over the Old Testament as well as here in the New Testament. So the function is to remove peace. It's not actually difficult. If you've got somebody who appears to be introducing the idea of the Antichrist to actually provoke war, no problem at all. We have people on the earth who actually, through the financial institutions will actually pay the people on both sides of a conflict, and they will benefit from it financially. They will give this crowd weapons and that crowd weapons. They don't care that people are dying as a result, but they benefit from it. So the red horse of war represents not an individual, but represents this whole process of warring and its terrible examples. Now, if I give you a few examples of warring at the time of the early church, it'll give you an idea that the white horse of the conquering Roman Empire was all over what today we call Europe and the Middle East. And the red horse of war was all over the place as well. For example, there were revolts in Palestine between 67 and 37 BC, and some 100,000 people actually perished. There was a revolt in Britain, what we call Britain today, under Queen Boadicea in 61 AD, and we're told that 150,000 people died. That's in personal hand-to-hand combat, actually human beings physically killing each other. We're told that when Nero committed suicide, I'm only giving you a couple of examples, when Nero committed suicide in 68 AD, there was absolute chaos in Rome. And 3 emperors followed in quick succession, followed by civil wars that absolutely rocked the empire. So the red horseman was pretty active in John's day. I'll tell you about our day later. Now, the black horse of famine always follows the red horse of war. Always. Because if the nations are battling and killing each other, there is no time to actually grow food, and there's no possibility of bringing food from one place to another. And so this represents the weighing scales. And we're given an example of what happened during these warring periods in the Roman Empire as John is speaking. And so he tells us, for example, that a quart of wheat, the Jerusalem Bible calls it corn, was a soldier's ration for one day, a denarius. And 3 quarts of barley, not wheat, were a family's ration. Now, the barley was considered less important than the wheat. And so the soldier, because he had a big job to do for the nation, he was given the better food than the people. But you're told that the oil and the wine is untouched. And I noted that when I was actually reading it for you. Why would that be so? Well, there are several ways of looking at it. One is that the rich continue to party while the poor starve to death. That's happening in the world as we speak. Whole nations can be starving to death, and the few ultra-rich people can be living lifestyles of excessive wealth. But you also have something else, and that is that the Emperor Domitian forbade the planting of vineyards, imagine in Italy, in order to stimulate cereal crops because of the shortage of food. But there was such an outcry in Italy about it that he had to repeal the edict, which is really very interesting. So probably both things are true. So what you have here is the unleashing of all kinds of things, but they're all from human beings. They all stem from humanity. This isn't heaven sending a white horse. This isn't heaven sending a red horse. This isn't heaven sending the black horse. All of these are the results of the actions of human beings. And we're told that the result was that 25% of the earth was killed. The depopulation of the earth. Remember that when we come to the 20th century and the 21st century. The depopulation of the earth is what many people are actually working towards. Now, of course, if 1/4 of the earth dies, 75% or 3/4 will survive. So when you're reading this and you're hearing these numbers, don't jump to conclusions and say, oh, this is the end of everything. It's not. It's the beginning. In the coming episodes, I will be talking more about the Book of Revelation. Slán agus Banach Déilibh, goodbye. God bless you.
Thank you for joining us today. We'd like to hear what you thought of today's session. Share your feedback with us at podcast@shalomworld.org. You can motivate and support us today. shalomworld.org/donate. Visit shalomworld.org for more information about Shalom World podcasts. To get the latest updates, make sure you follow us on Instagram at Shalom World Podcasts. We'll see you right back here tomorrow. Shalom World Podcasts is now available on all online platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and others.